Hi and welcome to this quick revision recap on the 7 deadly sins in J.B. Priestley's An Inspector Calls, which, as we already know, is part of the morality play structure. So the first deadly sin that we'll be looking at is greed. So greed can be applied to Mr. Berlin, and we know this through quotes such as, we know he was working with Crofts Limited for lower costs and higher prices, and we know that he viewed Eva Smith as cheap labour. So he was very interested in wealth and making sure he could retain as much wealth as he possibly could and work his way up the social ladder. And we know that Mr. Berlin sacked the women who asked for higher wages. So that meant Eva Smith, one of these women, was left unemployed. After leaving the employment of Mr. Berlin, Eva Smith then goes to work in a clothing store, which leads us on to envy. So we apply envy to Sheila, and we know that she was envious or very jealous of Eva Smith within the clothing store through quotes such as, first of all, the inspector asks Sheila, "You might be said to have been jealous of her," and Sheila actually responds with, "Yes, I suppose so." So she's very obviously representative of envy. But then we also learn that after Eva Smith supposedly smirks at Sheila, Sheila gets very, very upset, and in a fit of jealousy, because she's jealous that Eva Smith is actually prettier than her and would probably suit the dress that she was trying on a little bit more, we know that Sheila says, "I told him," the owner of the store, "that if they didn't get rid of that girl, I'd never go near the place again, and I'd persuade mother to close our account with them." So then she's forced the store owner into a very difficult place, and which results in Eva Smith then being sacked again. So then once again she's left unemployed. So after Eva has left the employment at the clothing store, she moves on to work with the women in the bar, which leads us on to pride. So pride is one of 2 deadly sins that can be applied to Gerald Crofts. And we know that he represents pride because of his inflated ego and the way he presents himself as Daisy Renton, otherwise known as Eva Smith's saviour. So we know that he feels like he rescued her from old Meggerty, who had wedged her into a corner with that obscene fat carcass of his. And then we know he goes on to inflate his own ego constantly, to the point that Sheila even mocks him by sarcastically saying that she's supposed to be engaged to the hero of it all. So Gerald Croft has overinflated his own ego to make sure that he is seen as Daisy Renton's saviour. So we'll revisit pride later, but for now we're going to go on to the second deadly sin that Gerald represents, which is lust. So we know that Gerald represents lust because of the way he sexualises Daisy Renton. He describes her soft brown hair and big dark eyes. So we already know he's only attracted to her physically. There is no love connection there. He also admits that he did keep a girl last summer. So he admits to having a sexual relationship with a lady. But the fact that he keeps her, it means there was no love behind the relationship. We know that Gerald kept Eva, or Daisy, in comfort with lodgings and money throughout the summer, so that he then, relating back to his pride, saves her from resorting to sex work over the summer. But then this casual relationship ends and Eva's eventually left with no money. This leads us on to the next deadly sin, which is sloth. So sloth is one of 2 deadly sins that we can apply to Eric. So we know that Eric is representative of sloth because he doesn't work. He's the only male in the play who doesn't work, and it's because he's instead considered a child. He's babied by his parents. We know this because, for example, Mr. Berling tells him, "Don't interrupt." and also he says to him, you've a lot to learn yet. So we know that Eric is childlike in his parents' opinion, and therefore he doesn't quite work yet. He relies on their money. We'll now look at the second deadly sin that Eric represents, which is gluttony. So we know that gluttony can be applied to Eric because he drinks excessively. And we know this because, first of all, Sheila says, you're squiffy, which means you're drunk. And Gerald also does say he does drink pretty hard. So we know that Eric does drink quite a lot. Also, in relation to his relationship with Eva, Eric freely says that I was in a state when a chap easily turns nasty. So we know he was drunk enough to do something he's regretted. So it's suggested here that he might have raped Eva, forced himself upon her, and after this a sexual relationship ensues. They meet up a couple of times, and Eva falls pregnant. But we learn that she doesn't want to marry Eric, she doesn't want to accept his money because of her own moral principles. So the relationship ends, and now Eva is left pregnant with no money. We'll now look at the next deadly sin, which is wrath. So wrath can be applied to Mrs. Burling, and we know that she becomes extremely angry when Eva presents at her women's charity with the name Mrs. Burling. Mrs. Burling says, she called herself Mrs. Burling. It was simply a piece of gross impertinence. So she's very offended by Eva using this name, and as a result of her anger at Eva using the Burling family name, she refuses to help Eva with money, and she says instead that Eva should contact the child's father for money to assist. So now we're left with the Inspector Gould. And we already know that he doesn't have any connection to Eva's death or the chain of events that leads to Eva's death. But we do know that he does represent one of the 7 deadly sins. So here we are, returning back to pride. So we know the inspector represents pride because he takes the moral high ground above the Burlings and Gerald, as he knows he's the only one who hasn't contributed to the chain of events that leads to Eva's death. So morally, he is higher and above the rest of them, which inflates his ego. We know that he feels he is morally higher than the rest of the play, the rest of the characters in the play, because he says towards the end, each of you helped to kill her, remember that, never forget it, which places him morally above them. So this helps to inflate his ego, and therefore he represents pride. So that was a whistle-stop tour of the 7 deadly sins in Inspector Calls. You might now want to go away and find some of your own quotes to help prove how each character represents their deadly sin. Thank you.